Before we start, a quick note about what this channel is and what it isn't. This isn't a recap channel, and it's not a highlight reel. We're here for the parts of Panem that happen after the cameras turn away. The systems behind the games. The contracts hidden inside victory. The lives that keep unfolding long after the anthem ends. Each video on this channel is built to slow things down, to follow the logic the Capital relies on, the details it hopes you won't connect, and the people who live with the consequences year after year. If that's the kind of Hunger Games analysis you're looking for, you're in the right place. Subscribing just means you'll keep a seat here when we move on to the next story. Now, let's start where Panem always wants you to stop paying attention. Picture this: a kitchen table in a one-room house in a poor district. No feast, no capital spread. Just thin soup, stale bread, and parents quietly going through ages, injuries, and school scores the way other families might plan a birthday. They're not asking who gets more cake. They're asking which child can afford more tesserae. At face value, tesserae is just extra grain and oil in exchange for extra entries in the reaping. The books frame it as a desperate individual choice. But in the poorest districts, that choice hardens into something else over time. It becomes annual, predictable, a tradition. You don't debate whether anyone will take tesserae. You debate who offers their name more often this year. So you get household rules. The oldest who can still work takes the most slips. The one with the better hunting skills protects the younger siblings by stacking the odds against themselves. Maybe an injured parent insists the healthiest child owes the family more chances. It's brutal math, passed down as if it's wisdom. That part matters because it turns survival into a ritual of deciding who is most expendable. Here's the real question. The Capital bans rebellion, songs, even a simple hand sign from District 12. So why does it allow, and structurally encourage, a tradition where families calmly sort their children into safer and riskier piles for the games? Why is a mother teaching her kid how to die for bread considered acceptable culture, when a melody about hope is treason? On the surface, these kitchen table negotiations can look almost resistant to us. Parents trying to shield younger kids, older siblings volunteering their names as a kind of private heroism. It feels noble. But step back and you see the relationship the Capital really wants. Families doing the Capital's work for them. No peacekeeper has to knock on doors and demand extra entries. The district self-policies shames selfish children who refuse tesserae and normalizes the idea that someone in the family must always be closer to the arena. There is a lot to uncover here because this isn't the only tradition that walks that line. Reaping day processions, workplace initiation rites, even mourning customs around dead tributes all blur into this same pattern. They look communal, even sacred, but they keep people resigned and divided, arguing over which child goes to the slaughter instead of why the slaughter exists. So in this episode, this is where we talk about those darkest district traditions the Capital never officially wrote into law, but quietly tolerated, even depended on. We're going to cover reaping rituals, deadly workplace games, grief that's turned into spectacle, and underground festivals that pretend to offer escape. And we're going to keep asking, where does culture end? And where does capital control begin? From horror to heritage. Why these traditions matter. So let's zoom in on one day you already know. The reaping. On capital screens, it's satin dresses, Effie's lashes, upbeat music that sounds almost festive. At face value, it's a lottery with good manners. But step back into the districts, and that same morning has mutated into something else entirely. A yearly ritual of dread, bargaining, and quiet math about who your family can afford to lose. In some districts, parents sew the same lucky shirt every year, even though it's never worked. Older siblings shave their heads or mark their arms the night before as if pre-claiming the role of tribute. Kids trade tesserae counts in whispers, arguing over who should take extra grain because they're stronger. Why keep doing this when everyone knows the odds don't care? Why repeat customs that only underline the horror? Here's the real question. When the games are fixed, ritual is the only part people feel they control, and the capital lets it happen. That part matters, because Snow's regime bans rebellion, not the tradition where a family quietly decides which child is most expendable. They encourage pageantry around the reaping, school assemblies, even district-made songs that dress up child sacrifice as heritage. Why shut down a custom that teaches kids to walk to the stage on cue? Why interfere when a festival has children practicing how to stand still, how to smile, how to die on command, while peacekeepers don't notice in the background? Victory doesn't break the cycle either. It deepens it. Any victor will tell you the games don't end when you win. They echo back as shrines built from scrap metal, yearly story nights where the same arena deaths are recited, and obligations the victor can never escape. In some places, if a victor comes home, there's an unspoken rule. They owe the dead. They have to visit certain families first, fund certain memorial feasts, repeat certain names every year so no one forgets whose children bought that new electricity. This is where we talk about traditions as a second arena. On reaping day, people compete to appear loyal enough on camera, to clap at the right volume, to keep their grief just below what might trigger a peacekeeper's baton. All year, they perform being good citizens by volunteering more tesserae, by raising kids to offer themselves in career districts, or by refusing to cry in public when a name is drawn. The games test bodies. These customs test whether you'll conform. There is a lot to uncover here, because once culture is weaponized, every song, every feast, every little superstition becomes part of the relationship between empire and subject. Why does the capital tolerate tribute shrines as long as they're not openly political? Because they vent grief instead of organizing it. Why do districts keep telling these stories anyway? Because in the ruins of Panem, meaning is the only resource you can't ration. And when we start unpacking specific traditions, you'll see how thin that line gets between survival strategy and self-policing. Our lens tonight, dark traditions as quiet weapons. So here's the move the capital makes that's easy to miss. They don't just permit these dark traditions, they outsource part of their control. To them, the core claim for this whole section is simple. As long as a district tradition takes fear, grief, and anger and pours it into a predictable pattern instead of open revolt, the capital not only tolerates it, it quietly relies on it. A yearly reaping eve lottery where families decide which child takes extra tesserae. Horrifying. But from the capital's perspective, it's efficient. The district does the emotional violence for them, because every one of these customs has a dual nature. On the surface, they're survival tools. You get mourning songs that help a mining town remember the kids lost in a tunnel collapse, or a food rite in District 11 that turns stolen grain into a secret memorial meal. At face value, That's community, that's coping, that's people insisting on meaning in a world built on the games. But here's the real question. What else are those same rituals teaching? When a district holds a festival where children practice dying on command to imitate tributes, it can start as morbid satire or as a way to help kids process the terror of the reaping. You turn the worst thing in your world into something you can perform, control, rehearse. That part matters because repetition quietly tells you this is inevitable. You're not supposed to imagine a world without the games. You're supposed to imagine a better death scene. So the lens we're going to cover in the next sections is very specific. We're going to treat each tradition as a design choice in a larger system, whether the capital planned it or the district stumbled into it. What emotional need is being met here? Grief, guilt, pride, fear. And politically, what function does it serve? Does a workplace blood right in a factory bond new workers, or does it train them to accept injury as the cost of survival, mirroring capital punishment on a smaller local scale? Here's the pattern interrupt. Not every dark tradition is resistance, and not every capital-approved ritual is pure control. The relationship is messier. A secret oath whispered in a black market stall might carry a rebellious message, but if it only ever results in a few broken rules and no organized action, Snow can shrug and call it cultural flavor. Meanwhile, a perfectly legal tribute shrine can cross the line into dangerous when grief turns from worshipping the games to questioning why the capital gets to decide who lives. The promise versus reality contrast is brutal. A district parade that honors its victors promises pride, legacy, hope that someone from your streets can beat the arena. In reality, you're training children to idolize people whose job is to survive state-mandated child murder and then smile on tour. A school trip to watch a public whipping is framed as a lesson in law and order. In practice, it's an annual ritual that teaches you your body belongs to the capital. And there is a lot to uncover here. From those child practice deaths to the way some districts turn first day in the mines into a mini-game, we're going to move district by district and peel back how far the capital let things go and where they finally drew the line. In tonight's map of Panem, from reapings to underground festivals. So to map all of this out, we need a tour plan, because these traditions don't all sit in the same emotional place. Some are about fear, some are about hope, some are about pure exhausted survival. First, we're going to cover the rituals orbiting Reaping Day itself. This is where we talk about family sacrifice customs, the volunteer that isn't really a volunteer, the quiet meetings where a household decides which child is most expendable, the districts that turn the lottery into a pageant just so it feels less random. At face value, the capital calls it civic duty. But here's the real question. Why did they let some districts build entire festivals around child sacrifice while pretending this was just culture? From there, we move into mourning and tribute worship. What happens after the names are called and the games are over? We'll look at districts that build illegal shrines to dead tributes, the body marking and tattoos you're not supposed to show peacekeepers, and the way grief gets redirected into worship. Why did the capital tolerate walls covered in candles and faces, as long as no one said the word rebellion? That part matters because it shows the relationship between controlled grief and controlled rage. Then we drop into the workplace, mines, factories, fields. The labor rights that mirror the games on a smaller, meaner scale. First day in the mines as a mini-game, productivity contests where the loser gets whipped in front of everyone, harvest quotas in District 11 that turn starvation into a yearly punishment ceremony. The question here is, when your job already feels like an arena, what does that do to the way you watch the real arena on screen? After that, we go underground. Black markets, secret oaths, coded festivals, songs that sound harmless to capital ears but carry rebellion instructions. Food rights where you're technically celebrating a good harvest, but everyone knows you're actually honoring the kids who never came home. This is where we talk about oaths whispered over contraband bread, or drinking games built around counting cannon blasts. To keep it grounded, we'll keep circling back to case studies. District 12 with its seamside wakes and hob rumors, District 11 with its field memorials and ruse song, District 2 with career training rituals that blur into worship of the games themselves, and some mid-tier districts we only glimpse. We'll use canon clues and then push the logic. If this is how the industry works, what traditions almost have to grow out of it? Later, we'll zoom out for a meta segment and ask whether the capital actually misunderstood some of these customs or quietly curated them as part of a control strategy. Were they blind? Or was this all on purpose? We'll close by jumping forward in time. Which traditions would a post-capital Panem keep? Which would it bury? And what would Katniss think of kids reenacting the games as history? And threaded through all of this, we'll compare what the books hint at versus what the movies sanitize, and how that changes your sense of just how dark the districts really are. If you're new to the village, this is where we talk about how all of this fits together. One clean line, we do deep dive analysis of all things Hunger Games, law, politics, world building, and the messy human stuff in between. If there's a strange tradition in some forgotten corner of a district, we're going to cover not just what it is, but why it exists, who it serves, and what it does to the people trapped inside it. At face value, that might sound intense for a story about televised child murder. But here's the real question. Why does a single loaf of bread from District 11 change the entire relationship between Katniss and Rue's people? Why does a three-finger salute spread faster than any official capital message? This channel lives in those tiny throwaway details. The hand gesture in the crowd, the way a peacekeeper pauses before a whipping, the offhand mention of a festival, and then unpacks the entire system behind it. If you've been here a while, you already know the promise. We stay spoiler-friendly for the main trilogy and the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. We'll reference specific scenes, the reaping in District 12, the victory tour stops, Snow's quiet threats. But we won't casually ruin late book twists if you're still reading or watching. And when we go beyond canon into what might have happened in District 4's docks, or how District 2 trained children off the books, we'll flag that as speculation, not secret canon. That part matters because Panem is already horrifying enough on the page. We don't need to invent a new set of games. We just trace the logic of the ones we have. When we ask whether a workplace tradition in a mine could quietly kill more people than the arena, or whether a district shrine to a dead tribute is worship or protest, we're building on what Collins gives us and then following the political consequences all the way down. So if you're into this kind of obsessive Panem archaeology, digging through one line of description to find a whole buried culture underneath it, consider sticking around. The comments on these videos turn into full district councils, people arguing over which rituals feel the most real, which feel the most terrifying, and which ones they could see their own community slipping into under capital pressure. Because remember, the capital banned open rebellion. It did not ban the ritual where a family quietly decides which child is most expendable before reaping day. It did not ban a festival where children practice dying on command while peacekeepers pretend not to notice. There is a lot to uncover here. So from this point on, think of the rest of the video as a tour through Panem's unofficial holiday calendar. Only the holidays are built on fear. Reaping Eve lotteries, mourning days that turn into tribute worship, first shift initiations in the mines. And our next stop, the traditions that grow up around Reaping Day itself, and why the capital was so eager to call that horror heritage. Reaping Day, when terror becomes a yearly ritual. Reaping Day is the one tradition every district shares. You stand in the square, you face the stage, you listen to the anthem. On paper, it's the same ceremony from District 1 to 12. Mandatory attendance, age groups penned in with rope, peacekeepers at the edges, 2 glass bowls full of names, and a capital representative who smiles too much for a day built on statistical child murder. At face value, it's standardized terror. But that sameness is exactly what creates space for difference. This is where we talk about the layers wrapped around the official script. The capital controls the middle of the day, the anthem, the speech, the drawing, the cameras. Everything before and after, that's where districts start building their own rituals of dread, bargaining, and pageantry that the capital quietly tolerates because those habits keep people predictable. Picture the morning. In one district, Reaping Day breakfast turns into a last meal spread. Real sugar if you have it, saved bacon, the good bread no one was allowed to touch all month. Parents tell themselves they're giving their kids strength. Kids know it's really a bribe. Eat, so we can say we did everything. In another district, the food goes the opposite direction, playing porridge, no talking as if drawing attention from fate is dangerous. Which version feels more hopeful? Which one actually changes the odds? There is a lot to uncover here in the quiet moments. Hair is braided slowly, the way Katniss describes her mother doing it. Not just to look neat for the cameras, but to keep hands busy so they don't shake. Clothes are washed the night before, houses scrubbed down at dawn, as if preparing for a funeral the family hopes they won't have to host. Some families force a joke or a story about a past reaping that turned out fine. Others enforce silence because naming the fear might make it real. Reaping Eve lessons become rehearsals in obedience. Stand still, don't fidget, don't cry while the cameras are on you. Teachers might turn it into morbid games. Who can hold their breath through the anthem? Who can stand the straightest in the heat? Because how else do you train 8-year-olds to perform composure on command? Factories stagger shifts, so no one can say they missed the square. The reason is always the same. The games are the law, and the law must be seen. Meanwhile, the capital leans hard into pageantry. Banners go up, music blares, children are told to wear their best clothes, turning the square into a twisted parade ground. Capital broadcasts zoom in on polished shoes and braided hair, on the promise of young faces, to sell Reaping Day as civic pride instead of a yearly lottery of death. And here's the real question. When you've put on the same best dress 10 years in a row, Is it still resistance to survive the day? Or has survival itself become the tradition? That part matters because the capital understands the relationship between repetition and acceptance. If every district family has a set reaping routine, this food, this braid, this path to the square, people start focusing on getting the ritual right instead of asking why the ritual exists at all. You're not fighting the games, you're fighting to keep your place in line. So, where's the tipping point? When does a survival script turn into culture, and how far will the capital let that culture go before it starts to sound less obedient and more dangerous? That's where we're going to cover the next layer of Panem's calendar. The traditions that don't just brace for the reaping, but quietly push back against it. District 12's silent rules, tesserae, tokens, and who owes the bowl more names. So let's drop into one district where all of that theory turns into something painfully specific. District 12. Coal dust, empty cupboards, and a reaping system that doesn't just select names at random. It tallies debt. At face value, tesserae is simple. You sign for extra grain and oil. You add extra slips to the bowl. Food for risk. A cruel but straightforward transaction. But here's the real question. What happens when an entire neighborhood quietly memorizes exactly how many times each child has signed? In the seam, that's the shadow economy. Families keep mental ledgers. This cousin took tesserae every year. That neighbor never did. Your household owes more names because you've been eating off someone else's danger. There is a lot to uncover here because it turns survival into a kind of math ritual. You're not just hungry, you're calculating probability. Older kids who can swing a pick or trade in the hob start taking extra slips because they're stronger. A 16-year-old brother might insist on more tesserae so his 12-year-old sister can stay at the base count. Parents swear they'll never pressure their children. But then winter hits, the mind's cut shifts, and the question changes from will we risk the reaping to which of us can most afford those extra entries. This is where we talk about unspoken rules. A father might secretly sign for tesserae in his own name as long as he's eligible, trying to shield the kids. A mother might skip meals so she doesn't have to ask her son to sign again. On the surface, no one is forcing anyone. In practice, the entire district understands that if you can work and you're not taking tesserae, you're letting someone else's child carry your share of risk. That part matters because it turns the bowl into a moral scoreboard. Who's selfish? Who's brave? Who's already paid? Katniss breaks that pattern. A hunting isn't just a hobby. It's an alternative tradition. In most homes, the cycle is predictable. Birthday, add slips, sign tesserae, hope the odds hold. In hers, the ritual is different. Slip under the fence, trade a squirrel, keep Prim's name as clean as possible. While other families accept tesserae as normal, she builds a parallel system of obligation. She owes the woods, the black market, Gale, not the capital's grain. That separation is cultural. It's why she feels out of step with neighbors who see tesserae as unavoidable, almost responsible. And then there are the tokens, not the glamorous capital-approved tokens tributes carry into the arena, but coal dust charms, braided threads, a pebble from the mine road. Kids in 12 slip them into pockets on reaping day, or smear a thumbprint of coal on their wrist because it worked last year. You get tiny family superstitions. Tap the doorframe twice before leaving, stand on the same flagstone in the square, Wear dad's old button. None of it changes the odds, but it changes the feeling. For a few minutes, you're not just prey, you're participating in a ritual you control. And the Capitol lets all of this happen. Why? Because every second you spend tracking your family's tesserae or clutching your charm is a second you're not organizing. The relationship shifts from district versus capital to household versus hunger. Your anger turns inward at the neighbor who never takes tesserae, at the girl who should have more slips than you. That's the real efficiency of these traditions. They fragment blame. And once you see that, you can start to ask a much more dangerous question. What happens when those private rituals finally spill out into something public? Festivals of fear, when reapings look like holidays. So when those private rituals finally spill out into something public, what do you get? In some districts, you don't get protest. You get a party. Imagine stepping into the square on reaping day in District 1 or 2, and at face value it looks closer to a festival than a funeral. Banners in jewel tones draped over the Justice Building. Stalls selling lucky tribute pastries or little sugar weapons. Kids with hair already styled in Capitol-inspired cuts, queuing to have a peacekeeper stamp a golden mockingbird on their cheek. It's all framed as civic pride. You're not walking into a lottery for death. You're attending your district's biggest annual event, and the Capitol absolutely feeds that. This is where we talk about encouragement as a weapon. Extra shipments of fabric and paint arrive for decorations. Capitol crews pick the most enthusiastic districts for extended broadcast coverage, replaying their cheers all over Panem. Mayors who stage the most elaborate pre-reaping shows get quiet rewards, new machinery, relaxed inspections, maybe even a personal call from a minor Capitol official. That part matters because it tells local leaders exactly what kind of atmosphere the Capitol wants. Not dread, but applause. So we're going to cover what that does to children who grow up inside it. If your earliest memories of Reaping Day are parades and costumes, you start practicing long before your name ever goes in. You rehearse smiling for imaginary cameras. You learn how to walk with your shoulders back, how to answer questions as if you're already a future victor. Teachers praise kids who look brave on the square. Parents whisper, "Hold your head high so sponsors will remember you." The games stop being a horror that happens to you and become a stage you're supposed to be ready for. Here's the real question. Where does that rehearsal start? In some places, it starts disturbingly early. Unofficial pageants for 8 or 9-year-olds. Mock reapings in classrooms where names are drawn, and the chosen child has to give a pretend interview or demonstrate a skill. Peacekeepers stand at the back, arms folded, supervising. On paper, it's just practice for a civic ceremony. In reality, it's early indoctrination. You learn that being picked means all eyes on you, and that's supposed to feel good. Pattern interrupt. Imagine a child crying when their name is drawn in one of these mock reapings, and the teacher gently corrects them. No, no, stand tall, be proud. The message lands before they even hit double digits. Fear is rude. Pride is required. So by the time you're actually old enough to volunteer, how much free will is left? If every parade, every fun rehearsal, every Capitol broadcast has told you that being chosen is the highest form of district pride, are you really deciding or just completing a script that was written for you? And if that script can turn a death sentence into an honor, what other traditions could the Capitol twist the same way? Children practicing how to die on cue. So if the script can turn a death sentence into an honor, what happens when kids start rehearsing the ending? Not metaphorically, literally practicing how to fall, how to go still, how to die on cue in the middle of the schoolyard. In a lot of fan discussions, we focus on volunteering traditions, on who steps forward. But here's the real question. What about the traditions that teach you how to disappear? Picture a reaping wheat game in some districts where a teacher claps or someone imitates a cannon blast, and every child has to drop flat and go silent. Last one to move gets reaped. It's tag, but the point of the game is learning to be a convincing corpse. At face value, that sounds too grim even for Panem. So why do parents and teachers go along with it? There is a lot to uncover here. Adults in the districts live with public whippings, executions, and peacekeepers who can decide your fate because you looked at them wrong. So they rationalize. If your kid can freeze on command, maybe they won't flinch during a surprise inspection. If they can swallow tears, maybe they won't cry on camera and draw the Capitol's attention for the wrong reason. This is where we talk about obedience drills dressed up as play. You can imagine factory towns where children practice lining up in perfect rows, hands behind backs, heads down, while older kids bark orders in a peacekeeper's clipped tone. Or mining districts where the fun challenge is holding a crouch in the dark without making a sound, because that's what you'll need when a tunnel collapses or when a patrol passes overhead. That part matters because it shows why the Capitol doesn't shut this down. On paper, these are harmless games. No weapons, no slogans, no open defiance. But psychologically, they're perfect. They teach that the state can demand your body at any moment, even if it's just to hit the ground and play dead. And your job is to perform your role so well that you avoid extra pain. The relationship between child and Capitol becomes a rehearsal stage. They act, the Capitol judges. And kids are kids. They turn everything into status. So suddenly, there's a hierarchy around who dies the best. The boy who can stagger 3 steps clutching his chest before collapsing. The girl who can hold her breath until her face goes pale. They become playground celebrities. You're already training a generation to understand that performance around death gets you attention, which is exactly what sponsor appeal will demand later in the arena. So what happens when the games stop being pretend? When the cannon blasts on TV match the ones the children have been mimicking since they could stand, some districts start inventing rituals for tributes who never come home. Empty chair dinners, silent parades, forbidden shrines tucked behind factory walls. But how do you mourn in a way that feels real without crossing the Capitol's invisible line between acceptable grief and dangerous memory? That's where the next set of traditions turns from coping mechanism into quiet rebellion, misting, shrines in the shadows, how districts mourn their dead. So what does grief look like in a place where the state owns death? It doesn't start with speeches or banners. It starts with a wall, a photo, and a candle that someone swears they didn't put there. This is where we talk about shrines in the shadows. Little pockets of memory the Capitol pretends not to see. In a mining district, you get names carved into the tunnel supports, initials scratched into beams where a tribute once worked their first shift. In a textile factory, it's a scrap of cloth tied around a pipe, a face sketched in charcoal that somehow never gets scrubbed off. At face value, it's just clutter. just workers personalizing their space. But here's the real question. Why does the capital allow any of this when they're so obsessed with control? The answer is in the rules you never see written down. Photos? Fine. Candles? Fine. A few wilted flowers or a small pile of food left where a tribute stood during their last reaping? Also fine, as long as it stays quiet. No slogans, no crowds, no speeches. One person lighting a candle is grief. 10 people lighting the same candle at the same time, that starts to look like a meeting. There is a lot to uncover here in District 11. We watch them throw bread to Rue's family. We see that charged moment of silence after Katniss salutes the cameras. That doesn't come out of nowhere. You're looking at a district that already had deep rituals around death. Field workers lost in accidents. Children starved before they ever saw the games. Funerals that probably turned into communal harvest songs and shared offerings. So when a tribute dies, the instinct is automatic. You feed the dead, you pause the work, you make space for the relationship between the living and the lost, even if peacekeepers are watching. Body marking becomes the portable version of those shrines. A tattoo of a mockingjay feather on a wrist in 12. A tiny stalk of wheat inked behind the ear in 11. A thin scar traced deliberately across the forearm in a district where work injuries are common enough to hide anything. To capitalize, it's just fashion, just another regional quirk. But to the families, that mark is a promise. I am carrying you with me. Every time the game's anthem plays, that symbol burns a little brighter. And this is where the emotional trade-off gets cruel. These rituals keep memories alive, but they also schedule the pain. Every reaping, families go back to the same wall, the same beam, the same empty spot at the table. Every victory tour, they touch the same tattoo and remember the moment that made them get it. The games don't just take once, they reopen the wound on command. So why does the capital tolerate that? Because it drains pressure. Grief that has a place to go is grief that doesn't always turn into rebellion. The real danger is when mourning stops being private and starts being shared on purpose. And those are the traditions the capital fears most, making district gods. So what happens when that private grief you just pictured stops being a photo in a drawer and starts being a god on the wall? This is where we talk about the saints of the arena. In some districts, a tribute doesn't just die. They graduate. A girl who took a spear for her younger brother in District 11 doesn't stay a statistic. She becomes the story you tell your kids when they fight over bread. A boy from 3 who rewired a careers trap and bought his allies 10 extra minutes. He's the reason parents whisper, "Be clever, not cruel," at bedtime. At face value, these are just folk tales, the same way any culture builds heroes. But here's the real question. What happens when every moral lesson has the games baked into it? You walk into a cramped kitchen in District 6 and see it, a shelf cleared above the stove, a faded games photo, a tiny district token, maybe a scrap of train ticket from the victory tour someone stole. Around it, pills set out for a medic tribute, or a toy train for the one who died in the bloodbath. There is a lot to uncover here, because those altars blend whatever religion or superstition the district had before with the capital's imagery. A miner's family in 12 might leave coal dust fingerprints on the frame. A fishing family in 4 leaves nets and shells, food, tools, symbols of work. The relationship between survival and sacrifice literally staged on a shelf. So why does the capital let this happen? Why allow people to kneel in front of a dead child's face and whisper prayers? Why not ban the shrines the way they ban slogans? The reason is brutally simple. Personal saints keep the pain personal. If every district is busy venerating its own fallen as guardian spirits, watch over our harvest, keep my son from the peacekeepers, then the anger stays local. You're emotionally invested in your district's narrative, not in a shared, system-wide rage. That part matters because it turns the games into a twisted family brand. Your saint, your story, your loss. Victors make it even messier. A victor walking home through the square isn't just a celebrity. They're a walking, breathing contradiction. In some places, they become living saints. People line up for them to touch a baby's forehead, bless a wedding charm, or put in a good word with a capital official they barely know. We're going to cover how that crushes them psychologically, but even here you can see it. They're expected to intercede with the same system that almost killed them. Refuse, and you're ungrateful. Accept, and you're complicit. And here's the last, sharp question this tradition plants. If every hero you've ever been given is someone who either died in the arena or came back marked by it, how do you even imagine heroism that doesn't run through the capital's script first? When courage always wears a district number and a sponsor pin, it becomes harder to picture a future where you're brave without playing the games at all. The moment someone offers a different model of courage, everything these household gods have been quietly propping up starts to shake. District 11's bread and silence. Grief as annual punishment. So when you zoom in from those household gods to a single district, District 11 hits you hardest. Because this is where we talk about grief that's been domesticated into a warning. A whole culture where mourning isn't just allowed by the capital, it's scheduled. You remember Rue's death. Katniss covers her with flowers, gives that three-finger salute, and for a second it feels personal, private, almost outside the games. Then District 11 answers. The old man in the square mirrors the salute, the whole crowd follows, and the peacekeepers move in with terrifying speed. At face value, it reads as spontaneous rebellion. But here's the real question. Does anything that coordinated happen for the first time on live television? District 11 doesn't just send bread to Katniss out of nowhere. They send a perfect coded message in the one luxury they control. Food. A whole loaf, costly sesame seeds, timed to land when she's most alone. There is a lot to uncover here. That part matters because it suggests a pre-existing ritual vocabulary, silent gestures, shared bread, collective risk, that the capital has clearly seen before and already decided how to punish. So what does that look like off camera year after year? Picture harvest season. The quotas are brutal. The work kills people quietly, falls from trees, heat stroke, accidents with peacekeepers' guns. You can imagine a moment at sundown where the fields go still for 60 seconds. Every head bowed for workers who didn't make it home. Maybe families of the dead receive a small portion of extra bread, broken and passed hand to hand as a promise that the district remembers what the capital writes off as loss of productivity. Over time, those customs bleed into how they mourn tributes. Reaping week, someone leaves a crust on the fence for the two names pulled. During the games, a communal loaf is divided whenever a District 11 tribute dies on screen. The capital thinks it's harmless, peasants sharing carbs. But for the district, It quietly forges a relationship between labor deaths, tribute deaths, and the same enemy. So why does the capital tolerate any of this? Because peacekeepers can weaponize it. They let the silence happen in the square, then drag someone out for a public whipping. They allow one night of songs after a tribute's death, then stage an execution at dawn framed as punishment for disrespect. The lesson becomes part of the calendar: grief, then blood. A ritualized 1-2 punch. Children in 11 grow up clocking this pattern. Reaping Day doesn't just mean the games start, it means local punishments are coming. You don't just ask who will die in the arena, you quietly ask who will be made an example in the square for crying too long, saluting too high, hesitating to cheer at the victory tour. From the outside, it looks like a proud, united district tradition. Bread shared, hands raised, voices joined. But inside District 11, the real ritual isn't remembrance, it's bracing. Every year, you honor the dead with one hand and flinch with the other, waiting to see how hard the capital will hit back this time. Victory's price, the secret debts victors owe the dead. And that flinch doesn't just belong to the crowds. It follows the victors home. Because in some districts, there's an unspoken rule. If you make it back from the games, you don't come back alone. Every dead child from your district is standing behind you, and you owe them, not metaphorically, practically, economically, emotionally. You become a walking debt. At face value, victory looks simple. You win, the capital crowns you, you move into Victor's village, and the district throws a feast. But here's the real question. What happens after the food is gone, the cameras leave, and the families of the kids you outlived still have to wake up the next morning? There is a lot to uncover here, because that's where districts start inventing their own dark traditions. In some places, the expectation starts on night 1. Imagine a custom where the new victor is not allowed to sleep in their mansion yet. Instead, they walk the main road of the district from end to end, past the square, past the factories or fields, stopping at every house that has lost a child to the games since the year they were born. Your birth year becomes the ledger. Every door is another entry. You knock, a mother opens. Maybe she spits. Maybe she pulls you inside and makes you eat at the empty place her son used to sit. Maybe she hands you his old jacket and says, "You wear it now." The peacekeepers don't interfere, because from their perspective, this is perfect. Grief turned inward, away from the capital, into a ritual of private blame. Over time, those expectations harden. This is where we talk about ritual as social law. Annual visits on Reaping Eve to the same homes, so the families can see what their child might have grown into. A victor quietly sponsoring tesserae for the poorest households, trying to keep other kids from ever entering the pool, paying for gravestones in a special games section of the cemetery, rows of identical markers that turn your reward money into marble reminders of who didn't get a mansion. Why would the capital allow any of this? Why let districts build traditions that keep the games' cruelty alive all year? The reason is brutally simple. A guilt-anchored victor is a controlled victor. You're emotionally broken, tied to your district's trauma, spending your time and money on penance instead of politics. That part matters because victors are the only people with both status and first-hand proof that the capital can be beaten in the arena. Keeping their hope tangled up with shame is a safety feature. So you end up with this twisted relationship. The capital parades you as proof of its generosity, while your own people treat you as a living IOU to the dead. You're never just a winner. You're a custodian of graves. And if this is what happens in districts that get a victor, what kind of traditions grow in the places that never get one back at all? Work as a blood sport. How labor rights mirror the games. Because here's the twist. Even if your district never sees a victor, you still have arenas. They're just called mines, factories, and fields. You grow up knowing the Hunger Games can kill you once a year. Work can kill you every day. So communities start doing something very human and very dark. They ritualize it. They build customs around the danger the same way other cultures build customs around weddings or harvests. And here's the real question. When death is built into your job description, how do you convince yourself it's anything but slaughter? This is where we talk about first shift. On paper, it's just your first day in the mines in District 12, or on a lumber crew in 7, or at a textile mill in 8. At face value, it's orientation. In practice, it turns into a trial. You're sent down the narrowest shaft. You're ordered to clear the jammed machine while it's still humming. You're told to ride the top of the coal cart, no harness, because that's how we all started. Older workers watch. They nudge each other. They call you tribute. There is a lot to uncover here, because the language is not an accident. They'll place quiet bets on who pukes from the dust first, who freezes on the scaffold, who doesn't come back after lunch. If you quit, you died in the bloodbath. If you stay, you earn a nickname from whatever almost killed you. Spark, cave in, 3 fingers. That part matters because it turns near death into a badge instead of a warning. Why does the district do this to its own children? One reason is brutal practicality. If you can't handle first shift, you probably won't survive the year. But the deeper reason is psychological. By framing survival as passing a test, the community gives you a twisted form of hope. You didn't just get lucky, you proved you deserved to be here. It's the same promise the games make, just scaled down to a factory floor. And the capital, management, the peacekeepers, they see all of this. At best, they look the other way. At worst, they quietly encourage it. A foreman jokes that no one is a real worker until they've bled on the line. A peacekeeper docks rations if production drops after an accident, so the crew pressures the injured kid to come back early. Suddenly, the workplace polices itself. Casualties aren't a scandal, they're tradition. So the relationship between state violence and custom gets blurred on purpose. Public whippings happen in the square. Crushed bodies disappear into the mine. Both send the same message. Your body exists for quotas or for entertainment, and either way, the capital gets what it wants. The arena trains you to die on camera. The job trains you to die off screen. And once death is normalized at work, what other rituals can grow in the shadows without anyone even calling them rebellion? District 12's mines. Initiation in the dark. In District 12, it isn't a secret army or a hidden arsenal. It's a doorway. Picture a new miner on their first day. You're still half a child, still smelling faintly of soap instead of coal, and before you even touch a pick, the older workers grab you. They drag a thumb through the dust, smear it across your face in a crooked cross, a stripe down the nose, a dot on the chin. Not random, the pattern matters. Forehead for memory, nose for breath, chin for stubbornness. At face value, it's a joke. They laugh, they shove you, somebody mutters, "Mountain, don't take this one yet. We still owe the capital." But then they all repeat it. A half-joking prayer to the rock overhead. That part matters because you can feel the fear under the humor. They're not only hazing you, they're bargaining with something they can't see. And here's the real question. If the capital has banned almost every dangerous tradition, why let this one live? We're going to cover the unofficial tests next, because this is where we talk about how cruelty turns into culture. The rookies go first into the narrowest shafts, the ones where you have to turn your shoulders sideways and pretend you don't notice the ceiling shedding dust. They're told to stand under the beam everyone knows is cracked, so you'll learn to listen. Maybe they forget to hand you a proper mask for your first full shift, watching your lungs burn while they measure how long you last before you cough or cry or quit. Is it superstition? Is it training? Or is it a rehearsal for dying on schedule? For the workers, there is a lot to uncover here. These rituals bond you to the crew. They bleed off terror with rough humor, and they give you this tiny illusion of control. If you pass the test, you belong. You did the thing, you said the words, you wore the coal the right way. The mountain has seen you now, and maybe that means it'll spare you. It's not rational, but it's a relationship with risk that feels better than admitting you walk into the dark with no promise at all. But the darker side is simple. Sometimes the beam doesn't just creak, it drops. Sometimes the rookie in the bad mask doesn't stop coughing. Sometimes the narrow shaft floods with gas and no one gets out. Those deaths become stories, tradition gone wrong, a warning, not a crime. Peacekeepers shrug, the foreman files a report, and the capital still gets its quotas. Every dead miner is replaced by another kid with a clean face and a shaky smile. Here's the pattern. Interrupt the capital never wants you to notice. In the arena, children die for ratings. In the mines, adults die for numbers on a clipboard. Different stage, same script. Both deaths are wrapped in ritual, so they feel inevitable instead of preventable. You train tributes with pageants and mentors. You train miners with coal dust blessings and cruel little tests. And once you see that, you have to ask, if the games have victors, what does victory even look like for the ones who only ever win another shift underground? District 2's blood oaths, training, loyalty, and the career machine. For District 12, victory has a very different shape. It wears armor. This is where we talk about the career machine. At face value, careers are just the kids who train, the ones who supposedly enjoy the games. But here's the real question. How do you get an entire district to treat sending its children to die as a community honor instead of a punishment? The answer isn't just training, it's tradition, staged and sharpened until it feels sacred. You can picture the selection feasts, long stone tables, quarry dust still on work clothes, families quietly competing with how much food they can pile in front of their strongest child. Not a reaping yet, but a rehearsal. Parents nudge shoulders broader, back straighter. Older siblings tell stories about past victors, which weapons they used, which mentors they impressed. And somewhere in that room, informal competitions break out. Arm wrestling, sparring, endurance tests. Because how else do you prove you're worthy of volunteering? There is a lot to uncover here. These aren't just kids who want to fight. They're being presented, offered up. In some cohorts, you can imagine a final moment at the end of the feast where the candidates stand and make public promises. If the reaping pulls a weaker name, they'll volunteer, they'll bring honor to the district, they'll win. Everyone watches, everyone remembers. And then you push it one step darker. What if those promises aren't just words? Picture a back room in the training center, or a quarry tunnel turned into a makeshift hall, trainees in a circle, palms out, a knife passed hand to hand, one cut each, blood pressed together as they swear that if their cohort chooses them, they will volunteer, no hesitation. It's not a capital law, it's a social contract. Break it, and you don't just disappoint your parents, you betray an entire micro-society built around obedience and victory. That part matters because the training centers themselves stop being gyms and start being temples. The walls are covered in names of past careers, etched into stone or painted in bold letters. Not just victors, also honored dead, tributes who placed high, who impressed the capital, who almost made it. Scars are displayed the way other districts might display medals. A ripped ear, a long white line across the ribs, a crooked finger from a broken grip, all become proof that you belong. Before every capital broadcast, you can imagine a ritual. Cohorts lined up in front of the screens, hands behind backs, mentors pacing the rows. A moment of silence when a District 2 victor appears on screen. Maybe they touch the wall of names. Maybe they recite a short oath for the district, for the games, for the capital. On the surface, it's pride. Underneath, it's conditioning. So why does the capital not only allow this, but quietly fund it? Because District 2 doesn't just send tributes. It supplies peacekeepers, stone for fortresses, and the human infrastructure of control. You want your enforcers to grow up believing that violence in service of authority is not just acceptable, but noble. You want a place where volunteering to die and volunteering to police feel like parts of the same honorable path. And once you see that, you have to ask, if District 2's blood-soaked traditions can be celebrated in broad daylight, what else is hiding in plain sight? What about the rituals the capital pretends not to notice? The black markets, the coded songs, the harmless festivals that might not be so harmless at all, the quiet districts 5, 6, 9, 10, and the traditions we never see. So if District 2 can turn killing into a public badge of honor, what happens in the places we barely hear about at all? Districts 5, 6, 9, 10, the quiet districts. On the map, they're just labels and industries. Power, transport, grain, livestock. At face value, that sounds almost boring compared to arenas and rebellions. But here's the real question. What kind of traditions grow in a place when the capital only cares about your output and your tribute count? Canon gives us almost nothing beyond job descriptions, which is exactly why there is a lot to uncover here if we stay grounded in what we do know about Panem. Every district has to make sense of the games, the reaping, and the work that keeps them alive. So they build stories, rites, little ceremonies that say this is who we are, even when who they are is defined by the capital's needs. Take District 6, transport. You spend your life moving other people's bodies and goods, but your own world is tiny. So imagine a first long-haul ritual, your first overnight run to the capital. Maybe the crew gathers at the rail yard, touches the side of the train for speed and safe return. and an older worker tells the story of the last driver who didn't come back. It's half superstition, half safety briefing, but the subtext is clear. Your value is in how reliably you keep the system moving. District 10's livestock traditions almost write themselves, and not in a comforting way. This is where we're going to cover those slaughterhouse initiations no one in the capital wants to think about. Picture a teen's first day on the kill floor turned into a rite of passage. You're handed the bolt gun, you're told the proper prayer for efficient meat, and everyone watches to see if you flinch. If you do, you get teased for weeks. If you don't, congratulations. You've proven you can separate feeling from function. That part matters because it mirrors the games perfectly. The ability to watch life end and keep working. District 9's grain, you get harvest festivals, but twisted. Public competitions between crews where the fastest field clears win extra rations, and the slowest have to work a double shift during the reaping broadcast. Maybe there's an old story that the capital once spared a family because their harvest numbers were so good. Is it true? Doesn't matter. The tradition keeps everyone racing, even when the work itself is killing them. And then reaping day. This is where we talk about the local pageantry the cameras never bother to explain. In 6, tributes painted with silver lines down their arms for speed, marching as if they're already in motion. In 10, leather vests, little horned headbands, slogans about strength of the herd. In 9, sheaves of dyed grain, songs about abundance and feeding the nation. The tributes become mascots of power, of productivity, of plenty. Are those costumes pride or propaganda? The answer is yes. That's the relationship the capital cultivates on purpose. You're taught to be proud of your district's role, but only in the exact terms that serve the system. Children grow up seeing that the best thing you can be is a perfect symbol of your industry, even if that symbol is walking to their death. And here's the unsettling part. From inside those districts, none of this would feel remarkable enough to narrate. If Katniss grew up in 6 or 10, would she even mention the first run ritual or the slaughterhouse prayer? Or would it just be how things are, the same way she barely explains Tesserae because it's baked into her bones? Once you realize that, you have to ask, if these mid-tier districts can turn work and reaping into seamless tradition, what happens when mourning and rebellion start to blur too? What about the shrines, the scars, the quiet ways people remember their dead tributes when the cameras go home? Black markets and blood pacts, the traditions that stay off camera, those shrines and scars are the public face of grief. The real question is, what about the traditions that never see daylight at all? This is where we talk about the hob and all the hobs that never got named. At face value, it's just a black market. Meat for thread, coal for medicine, maybe a loaf of bread that somehow dodged capital ration counts. But spend more than 5 minutes there and you realize it runs on ritual as much as on supply and demand. You don't just stroll in and start trading. You're introduced. Someone vouches for you. Your first deal is almost always unfair on purpose, a kind of initiation tax that proves you understand who has the power to cut you off or protect you later. There is a lot to uncover here. Notice how certain stalls are never raided, even when peacekeepers sweep through. That's not luck. That's etiquette. You don't bring heat on the old woman who sells herbs because she treats coughs for free. You don't cheat the butcher whose brother fell down a shaft after talking back to a foreman. There's an unspoken rule in almost every district market. Some people are off limits, and if you forget that, no one hears you when you scream for help in the alleys behind the warehouses. So if the hob is the visible tip, what's underneath? Oaths. Not written, never spoken where walls can listen, but absolutely binding. We're going to cover the games and victors, but you have to understand the ecosystem they come from. Smugglers swear you never name the trapdoor under the laundry, never repeat which peacekeeper can be bribed, never break under interrogation even if it means your own kids lose their extra grain. Lookouts promise to warn every stall before they run. Information brokers promise that if you get taken, your family still gets your cut. That part matters because it turns crime into a kind of parallel social safety net the capital never officially funds, but quietly benefits from. How do you know who's in? Not with tattoos, that's too easy to catalogue. Think smaller. A certain way of knocking on a back door. 3. Pause. 2. Long pause. 1. A phrase slipped into casual talk. Hope the trains run on time this winter. That sounds harmless, but in the right relationship means I'm safe to speak in front of. Maybe it's a strip of red thread on the inside of a sleeve, or a button always fastened wrong. Details so ordinary that capital cameras pan right past them. Here's the real question. If you're snow, what's worse? Starving districts with nothing to lose, or districts that can barely scrape by thanks to illegal networks you can monitor? Crack down too hard and you get empty bellies. Empty bellies lead to full streets, and suddenly you have another District 11 riot on your hands. Tolerate just enough smuggling, and you create a pressure valve. People spend their energy chasing sugar and morphiling instead of planning sabotage. But that trade-off has a flaw the capital never fully calculates. Some underground traditions are about survival, yes, but others start drifting into memory and resistance. A smuggler's feast that happens every year on the same night a local victor died. A children's song that's really a map of safe houses. A festival stew that only gets cooked when peacekeepers change shifts, because that's when it's safest to move. The capital sees food, music, regional colour. They don't see the rehearsal. Yet, songs, recipes, and secret codes. Resistance hidden in plain sight. So when you hear, they don't see the rehearsal, yet you have to ask, rehearsal for what? For open revolt, yes, but also for something quieter. The moment when a district child realizes the song they've been humming their whole life is actually about a man hanging from a tree and asking, very calmly, if you're ready to run. The hanging tree is the clearest blueprint we get. At face value, it's a creepy folk ballad, a warning not to wander. But here's the real question. Who writes a warning that functions as an invitation? Are you is a check-in, a roll call. And that part matters because once you see that, you start to suspect it's not the only one. You start to imagine versions in other districts, where a single verse shifts to encode a local execution, a vanished family, a peacekeeper raid that never made the broadcasts. So what about the work songs no one bothers to film? In Eleven's fields, you can picture Low dragging chants that match the swing of a scythe. To the capital, it's productivity music, background noise. But we're going to cover the double meanings. A line about empty baskets that's really about empty chairs at the table, or counting rows that's counting the dead from last year's quota. In 4, the dock shanties probably talk about storms, broken nets, the sea taking what it wants. The official version is about respecting nature. The quiet version is about dreaming of currents that pull you past capital patrols and never bring you back. This is where we talk about food doing the same work. Imagine a thin barley stew in 12 that only appears on reaping eve. Every family adds one ingredient tied to a lost tribute. A sprig of rosemary for a girl who liked herbs. A pinch of sugar for a boy who never tasted cake. The capital sees poor people stretching rations. The district sees a table of names. In 2, maybe there's a dense white bread shaped into perfect little rolls served the night before the reaping as a good luck tradition. The joke everyone's in on? It's a knockoff of capital party bread, intentionally undersalted, to mock the promise of luxury that only arrives if your child survives the games. And then there are the festivals. On paper, they're viewing parties for the opening ceremonies or the start of the games. Snow gets his footage, districts gathered, screens glowing, toasts raised. But the timing works both ways. Underground, those same nights become the safest cover for resistance gatherings. Too many people on the streets to track. Too much noise to hear a single forbidden verse. You can imagine a toast where the words praise the capital's unmatched generosity, and the whole crowd laughs, not because it's funny, but because they all know generosity is their code word for incompetence. Pattern interrupt for a second. The capital loves this stuff. They package regional flavor into pre-game segments, cut to children clapping along to bright, bouncy tunes. The irony, some of the most cheerful songs are probably the meanest. Imagine a jaunty District 6 rhyme about missing trains. That's actually about sabotaging shipments. Or a District 3 clapping game that, if you tap it out on a table, spells snow lies in Morse. The capital needs culture to sell the games as a pageant, but culture is the one thing they can't fully script. So they broadcast the very tools districts are using to remember, to grieve, to hate them more efficiently. And as the years go on, those secret codes don't just hide in songs and stews. They start bleeding into the rituals the capital thought it owned completely. The reaping itself. Public whippings as annual lessons. When punishment becomes tradition, and the reaping isn't the only ritual the capital thinks it owns. There's another calendar event districts know by feel, not by date. The day someone is going to bleed in the square. Picture the structure. A siren at dawn, peacekeepers at every corner, the same barked summons echoing off brick. Work stops. School dismisses early, but not as a treat. You file into the square the same way you file in for the reaping, shoulder to shoulder, pushed toward the front if you're young enough to need the lesson. The post is already there. Or the scaffold. The capital doesn't improvise this. It's a template. At face value, it's punishment for some offense. Stolen tesserae, poaching, talking back, maybe a rumor of helping a runaway. But here's the real question. Why does it always feel so rehearsed? Same raised platform, same peacekeeper reading charges, same pause before the first crack of the whip so the cameras can catch the silence. This is where we talk about schools, because once something happens every year, teachers start planning around it. You get the warning lecture the day before, a dry recitation about order, laws, the safety the capital provides. There is a lot to uncover here. The next day, attendance is taken in the square instead of the classroom. And afterward, When you're still hearing the sound of leather on skin in your head, you're assigned an essay on why obedience keeps your district safe. That part matters because it turns terror into homework. It gives you a script for what you just saw. You don't write, "I was afraid." You write, "The Capitol protects us from chaos." The relationship between student and state violence becomes grammatical, subject, verb, lesson. At home, it mutates again. Parents argue quietly the night before. Do they keep the 8-year-old back, risk a fine, or do they bring them and hope the child forgets the worst parts? Older siblings become unofficial mentors in horror, whispering what to expect, when to look away, when not to flinch, so a peacekeeper doesn't notice you. Neighbors trade stories. The whipping 3 years ago when the victim passed out on the 5th strike. The execution where the gun jammed and everyone had to stand there longer. So why does the Capitol allow this to become semi-predictable instead of random? Because predictability lets people schedule their fear. You brace for that week. You're extra careful with rations, with curfew, with what you say in the mines or the fields. When the victim isn't you or anyone you love, there's a sick, quiet relief. You survived the year's lesson. And that's the twisted genius. The punishment isn't just about the person at the post, it's about training an entire district to exhale on cue, to feel a perverse gratitude that the game stayed out there and the whip stayed over there. So, if fear can be scheduled and grief can be ritualized into essays and dinner table whispers, what happens to hope? We're going to cover why Snow doesn't want hope dead. He wants it domesticated, housebroken, showing up on time, never strong enough to cancel the next summons to the square. Why let them volunteer? The meta question behind district traditions. So if fear is on a schedule and grief has a script, here's the real question. Why does the Capitol allow the districts to decorate the gallows? If your whole goal is control, why not strip the games down to pure math? 2 names, 1 drum, no volunteers, no parades, no district colors, no homegrown rituals. Just a yearly execution with better camera angles. At face value, that sounds even scarier, right? No loopholes, no heroics, no chance for your older brother to shout, "I volunteer," and turn your horror into a story. Imagine that version of Panem for a second. Reaping Day is a number, not an event. No homemade tokens, no songs, no family tradition of deciding which child is most expendable. The train still comes. The tributes still die. But there's no pageant, no interviews, no Caesar Flickerman to laugh with. Just names, deaths, and silence. It's efficient, brutal, clean. And that's exactly why it's dangerous. A system that only offers you terror gives you nothing to hold except hatred. There is a lot to uncover here, because terror without distraction forces people to stare straight at the reason their children are dying. You can't rebrand it as honor or strategy or our district's way. You can't tell yourself that your volunteering tradition or your reaping festival or your shrine to a dead victor means you're participating in something bigger than slaughter. So the Capitol does something smarter. It lets each district wrap the knife in its own cloth. They encourage festivals around the reaping to feel ancient and proud instead of newly imposed. They let families invent little lotteries inside the big lottery, or hold those grotesque send-off feasts where children practice bowing, smiling, even dying on cue while peacekeepers pretend it's just culture. That part matters because once you have a script, you stop improvising. Traditions, even dark ones, give you a role. You're the mother who always braids the tribute's hair. You're the miner who tattoos the names of the dead on your arm. You're the factory crew that turns a yearly workplace game into a private echo of the arena. In a twisted way, it feels voluntary, predictable, containable. This is where we talk about illusion. When a district worships a dead tribute as a saint, the capital tolerates it as long as the candles stay apolitical. Grief vents into rituals instead of organizing into rebellion. When a child volunteers because that's what our district does, Snow wins twice. He gets a spectacle, and he gets someone who believes they chose the stage. So why let them volunteer? Why allow the pageantry, the district customs, the homegrown horrors? Because Snow doesn't just want people afraid of the games. He wants them emotionally invested in the games. To hope their district wins. To promise their kids that training harder, dressing better, playing the role smarter might save them. In other words, the capital doesn't ban hope. It breeds a specific poisoned version of it. And next, we're going to cover how that hope is carefully measured against fear. Exactly enough to keep you watching, never enough to make you walk away. Hope versus fear in the districts, Snow's favorite equation. Hope and fear aren't opposites in Panem. They're a matched set. Snow spells it out for Seneca Crane. Hope. It is the only thing stronger than fear. A little hope is effective. A lot of hope is dangerous. That line isn't just about the arena. It's the design document for every district tradition the capital allows to exist. The question isn't, is there hope? It's how tightly is it fenced in? Take the reaping festivals. At face value, they're civic ceremonies, banners, music, kids in their best clothes. But listen to what people actually hope for. You hope your child's name isn't called. You hope the Tesserae debt doesn't catch up with you. Maybe, if your district is ambitious, you hope your tribute at least dies quickly. There is a lot to uncover here, because all of that is hope aimed at surviving the rules, not changing them. Career culture in 1 and 2 runs on the same equation. Those kids grow up training, reciting victor statistics the way other districts recite grain quotas or coal tallies. The promise is clear. If you work hard enough, if you volunteer, you might become a victor, move your family, feast in front of the cameras. But here's the real question. Why does the capital happily tolerate gyms full of teenagers practicing murder? Because their hope is perfectly bounded. They dream of winning the games, never of ending them. Even the darker customs, tribute worship, shrines, body marking, follows Snow's rule. Families in poorer districts carve names into walls, leave food at illegal memorials, whisper stories of their fallen girl or boy. The capital lets that grief breathe just enough. You can light a candle. You can pray to a dead 16-year-old as a saint of survival. You cannot ask why the saint had to die in the first place. This is where we talk about the black markets and secret oaths. On the surface, they're about trade, bread for wire, morphling for stolen medicine. Underneath, you get blood promises. If your child is reaped, I'll volunteer. Or, if I win, I'll send money back through the hob. Those oaths feel rebellious, but notice the boundary. You're rearranging the odds inside the games, not questioning why the games exist. That part matters because it turns resistance into a personalized insurance policy. Even the songs and underground festivals that clearly carry resistance DNA mostly center on endurance. District 12's mining chants, the field songs in 11, the quiet toasts to next year during the victory tour, these rituals say, "We will outlast this." They rarely say, "We will overthrow this." As long as the lyrics stay about holding on, the peacekeepers shrug and let the chorus finish. So you end up with what we can call bounded hope. You can hope your shift ends safely. You can hope your tribute makes it home. You can even hope your district finally produces a victor and earns a new roof for the school. You just can't hope for a world where no one's child is reaped at all. But if hope is being rationed so carefully, here's the next question. Is every district getting the same dose? Or has snow quietly given some people a much more dangerous kind of hope? And what happens when those hopes finally collide? Career carnivals versus starving vigils. A sociological tour of Panem. Those colliding hopes don't just exist on paper. You can walk the map of Panem and feel them in your bones. On one end of the line, you've got districts 1, 2, and 4, the so-called career districts. On the other, places like 11 and 12, where the games arrive the way winter does. Cold, inevitable, and never on your side. At face value, it's the same system everywhere. 2 names, 1 train, 1 arena. But here's the real question. How does one framework produce children who volunteer to die and others who have to be dragged to the stage? In the career districts, the pre-games season plays out as a carnival. You grow up in training halls that are basically gladiator prep schools, with older, almost victors teaching you how to throw a spear before you've lost your baby teeth. Families host feasts the week before the reaping, not to mourn, but to show off their strongest kids. There are sparring exhibitions, sponsor mixers, and rituals where mentors bless chosen trainees, turning the arena into a promised stage for district glory. You're not just surviving there, you're auditioning. Parents angle for the right trainers. Children compare kill scores from practice simulations. And the whole district treats the games as a career fair with higher stakes. That part matters because it answers the capital's favorite question: how do you get people to participate in their own punishment and call it ambition? You sell them the relationship between victory and status so hard that volunteering feels rational. Now jump to District 11 the night before the reaping. No training center, no feasts. Families stay up late around kitchen tables with almost nothing on them, cutting a single piece of bread into too many slices. They whisper about tesserae, about whether the extra grain was worth the extra entries. And they don't hold showcases, they hold vigils. Some slip out to illegal shrines for dead tributes, leaving offerings of fruit or seeds, praying that this year's children will be passed over. In 12, you see the same energy with different props. Coal dust instead of orchards, but the ritual is familiar. Parents watching their kids sleep, or not sleep, in case this is the last ordinary night. The only training is learning how to stand still on the square without collapsing. This is where we talk about fear as a tradition, staying quiet, wearing your best clothes because there's nothing else you can control. Here's the pattern interrupt. Both ends think they're making opposite choices. One district raises killers, another raises ghosts. But both are trapped in performances, the Capitol wrote. Pride on one side, terror on the other. And either way, the cameras get what they need. These differences don't just color local culture, they harden class lines. If you grow up in two, the poor districts are where weak tributes come from, the ones your careers are supposed to eliminate on day one. If you grow up in 12, the career kids are monsters who volunteered for what you'd do anything to avoid. So how do you build cross-district solidarity when the games have taught you that the person who might save you is also the face on the poster that killed your friend last year? There is a lot to uncover here, because the Capitol doesn't just tolerate these traditions, it needs them. But what happens when those carefully managed roles start to crack, and a career district child stops playing the hero, or a starving district child refuses to play the victim? District 4's sea rights and District 1's gemstone pageants. So what happens when a district raises its children to believe the arena is just an extension of home? This is where we talk about District 4 and District 1, the places where industry and privilege don't just support the games, they rehearse them. Before the train, before the cameras, the tributes are taken out on boats at dawn. No crowd, just family and a peacekeeper patrol in the distance. They kneel, touch the water, and swear to bring the tide to the arena. At face value, it's a sweet fishing tradition. But here's the real question. When you teach a child to promise the sea they'll spill blood for it, what kind of relationship to violence are you building? Families toss offerings into the waves, shell necklaces, carved hooks, maybe a scrap from an old victor's uniform. The Capitol lets this happen because it looks poetic on camera. But the real reason is simpler. Every coin sinking into that bay is a reminder that your child now belongs to something bigger than you, not a community. The games, back on shore, the training starts years earlier. Kids diving for weighted objects until their lungs burn, racing to see who can stay under longest. Mock drown or survive games where someone always ends up coughing water and laughing too hard, pretending they weren't scared. Scars from coral, hooks, boat rigging, those become marks of honor, not warnings. You don't say, be careful, you say you're getting ready. There is a lot to uncover here, because the Capitol doesn't have to brutalize District 4 directly. The district does half the work itself, then calls it tradition. District 1 twists that same logic into glamour. Instead of boats, you get gemstone-themed pageants. Children dressed as luxury goods, living diamonds, walking necklaces, human perfume ads, paraded across a stage under crystal lights. They perform routines that prove beauty, poise, and the ability to smile under pressure. You're not just pretty, you're marketable. And the top performers, quietly flagged, groomed as future volunteers, coached on how to cry on cue for interviews, and then stop the tears exactly when the cameras need a stronger shot. Victory parades in both districts blur mourning and bragging. In 4, a returning victor rides past murals of stylized waves swallowing tiny silhouettes of opponents, tridents and nets displayed beside preserved weapons from the arena. In 1, floats glitter with enlarged gemstones carved into the faces of the fallen, trophies arranged so the message is clear. Look what our tribute did to them. You're told to grieve, but also to be impressed. That part matters because it teaches children that the only acceptable sorrow is the kind that still sells a story. So if the wealthy districts glamorize the games this hard, here's the real question. When the movies adapt all of this, how much do they glamorize? or quietly sanitize the districts themselves to keep our sympathy exactly where the capital would want it. Book versus movie Panem. What traditions got erased? So when you move from the page to the screen, you have to ask, what happens when all those district traditions get cropped out of the frame? At face value, the movies show you sorrowful crowds, grey clothes, a few raised hands. You get the mood. But here's the real question. Do you still feel how deep the games have sunk into everyday life? In the books, Suzanne Collins lingers on tiny, repeated gestures. The three-finger salute in District 12, the way bread carries secret messages between districts, songs that move through the crowd like a current. There is a lot to uncover here, because those moments aren't just Easter eggs. They're the skeleton of a culture that's been forced to organize itself around annual child sacrifice. On screen, those same elements are there, but they're streamlined, turned into quick visual beats instead of ongoing rituals. Think about Tesserae. On the page, Katniss walks you through the math. How many entries? How it multiplies every year? How many times Gale's name is in that bowl? You feel the numbers strangling people. In the movies, Tesserae is mentioned, but we don't sit with the arithmetic of desperation. That part matters because the tradition of taking Tesserae becomes just a sad fact, not a family ritual where siblings negotiate who risks their name so the others can eat. Same with background details. The books hint at shrines to dead tributes, carved initials in the seam, body markings that quietly track who's lost someone in the mines or to the arena. You get the sense that every district has its own way of folding the games into mourning. On film, you mostly see a generalized, sad crowd. Fewer candles, fewer improvised altars, almost no district-specific customs unless they're plot-critical, like ruse people whistling and saluting. Why smooth all that out? This is where we talk about production reality. You've got limited runtime, a PG, 1/3 rating, and a story that has to stay pinned to Katniss's perspective. If every district we visit during the Victory Tour had its own fully realized ritual system, each stop turns into a mini ethnography. Great for world building, terrible for pacing. So the adaptation trims. Less Tesserae math, fewer close-ups of body scars that are actually coded memorials, more quick inserts of crowds that all read as oppressed in the same visual language. But there's a cost. Without those granular traditions, Panem on screen can drift toward generic dystopia, brutal government, sad people, big TV show. The relationship between the capital and the districts feels simpler, more top-down, and you lose the horrifying sense that people have built intricate, sometimes complicit ways to live with the games. That's the reason the book version of Panem feels so specific. It's not just what the capital does, it's what the districts do in response. So here's a pattern interrupt for your brain as we keep going. Next time you see a wide shot of a reaping or a factory line, mentally restore the missing traditions. Imagine the off-camera shrines, the unspoken rule about who takes Tesserae this year, the song they're not allowed to sing while the cameras roll. Because once you start filling those back in, the next set of district rituals we're going to cover gets a lot darker and a lot more believable. Living with the games, a year in the life of a District 12 family. So let's stop talking in abstract for a second and walk into one kitchen in District 12. It's reaping day. You wake up before the whistle because everyone does. The mother in this family always boils water first, even when there's nothing to put in it. At face value, it's just tea without leaves. In practice, it's a roll call. If you're alive and home, you touch the warm kettle. No one says why. No one has to. Clothes are laid out the night before. The good shirt, the least frayed dress. The father checks the tesserae slips under his breath, the way some people count prayers. Here's the real question. Are they hoping the odds are in their favor, or just that the cameras cut away fast if they're not? In the square, they stand in the same spot. Every year, 3 bodies tight, 1 slightly behind. That part matters because it's a private rule. The person in back is the one everyone silently agrees is most likely to go. They rotate that position yearly so the burden doesn't calcify on one child. The capital sees a crowd. The family sees a map of fear. When the names are called and it isn't them, the ritual doesn't end. Back home, they keep the screen off for exactly 1 hour. It's their tax to the dead. Only after that do they allow the mayor's speech to drone in the background while the mother kneads bread harder than necessary, working panic into something edible. Then the year moves on, but it never really moves away from the games. In the mines, the eldest son's first shift came with an initiation. Helmet lights snapped off, canary cage rattled, older workers whispering, "Hear that?" That's the arena. It's cruelty with a punchline, but it's also training. If you can breathe through this, maybe you can breathe through anything. We're going to cover how workplaces copy the capital's violence, but here you see it in miniature. After shift, the father detours through the hob. Trade has its own etiquette. You never say Hunger Games out loud. You tap 2 fingers on the table instead. 2 taps means you're trading in something games related. Old betting notes, scrap fabric dyed capital bright, a smuggled clipping of a victor's face. The reason is simple. Words can be overheard. Fingers can't. In their kitchen, the calendar is crowded with dates the capital doesn't recognize. The day a cousin died in a mine collapse. That's stew night, stretching everything thin, but making sure everyone gets some. The day a local tribute made it to the final 3 once. Years ago, that's when they allow a spoonful of precious jam, a tiny, bitter celebration of almost. When the games start, their schedule bends around the broadcast. They watch the parade together because the capital can't resist making that part pretty. But this is where we talk about boundaries. The mother turns the screen off for the bloodbath at the cornucopia every single year, no matter what. She tells the younger kids the feed glitched. Everyone older plays along. On rest days, they visit a makeshift shrine behind the slag heap. Just stones, coal dust and initials carved with a nail. They never bring flowers. Too obvious. They bring songs instead. A band melody hummed under the breath. Never quite loud enough to form full rebellion, but just enough to keep the relationship between grief and resistance alive. They use nicknames for capital figures that sound respectful in public and mocking in private. President Snow becomes the gardener at home because he's always pruning. A game maker is the weatherman, blamed loudly whenever a storm ruins laundry day. On the anniversary of a tribute's death, the mother bakes 1 extra roll and sends the youngest to accidentally drop it near a neighbor's door. No one mentions it, everyone understands. Hope in this district is measured in crumbs. And the thing to remember is, this is one family, one set of rules, one warped holiday cycle built around terror, work, and tiny acts of defiance. So, how many different calendars of fear, grief, and dark celebration are ticking away across all of Panem at any given moment? And how did the capital decide which ones to tolerate and which ones to crush? When tradition becomes a cage, the psychology of "we've always done it this way." So here's the uncomfortable twist. A lot of the darkest district traditions the capital allowed weren't enforced from above. They were enforced from inside people's own heads. This is where we talk about the psychology of "we've always done it this way," because on paper, some of these customs look obviously cruel. A family drawing pebbles on reaping eve to decide which child takes extra tesserae. A factory shift turning a public whipping into an annual lesson. At face value, you'd think people would just stop. So why don't they? Start with fear and how your brain hates randomness. The reaping is pure lottery horror. Anyone, any year. So families start doing small rituals. The same soup the night before, the same charm in a pocket, the same path walk to the square. Last year you did X and your child wasn't chosen. Your brain quietly connects those dots. Do X again. Do it harder, because the alternative is admitting there is no protection at all, and that part matters because in a world built on the games, admitting that kind of helplessness can break you. Now add social pressure. In a surveillance state, refusing a tradition doesn't just make you odd, it makes you suspicious. If your district has a reaping parade where children practice bowing or even dying on cue and your kid doesn't join in, what does that say? Are you ungrateful for the capital's mercy? Are you disrespecting the tributes? One sideways glance from a peacekeeper, one neighbor muttering that you're arrogant, and suddenly your private moral stand looks a lot more dangerous than going along. Here's the real question. How do these habits survive for generations? The answer is that elders don't only teach what to do, they teach how to feel. When the names are drawn, this is when you cry. When the anthem plays, this is when you cheer. When the cameras sweep past the crowd, this is when you go stone-faced, because tears might be seen as weakness and too much joy might be read as disloyalty. There is a lot to uncover here in terms of emotional choreography. You're not just inheriting a calendar, you're inheriting a script, and the capital loves that. Once a tradition is rooted, the emotional climate maintains itself. Snow doesn't have to send a memo telling District 4 to hold a tribute feast of seafood in honor of their dead. He just lets them keep doing it, because every year it refreshes the relationship between grief and spectacle. Public executions become yearly school trips, factory initiation games that injure new workers, echo the arena on a smaller scale. The regime doesn't need constant intervention when the culture does the work for free. But here's the knife edge we're going to cover next. If tradition can be a cage, what happens when rebellion finally arrives? Do those same rituals flip? Songs, feasts, secret oaths into weapons the capital never saw coming? Or do they keep people clinging to the old promises of safety, even as the world starts to burn? Traditions in revolt. How old customs get rewired. So when rebellion finally shows up, it doesn't arrive with brand new rituals. It walks in wearing the old ones. The first and clearest example, that three-finger salute from District 12. At face value, it starts as a small, local mourning gesture, a way to say, "I see your loss," without daring to say anything about the games themselves. But here's the real question. What happens when the cameras linger on Katniss giving that salute to Rue's district, and then on District 11 answering back? Suddenly, a private grief symbol becomes a public relationship. The signal jumps the fence. Now every district watching knows there is a wordless way to say no. Peacekeepers can ban speeches, cut sound, shut down gatherings. They can't stop fingers. So a gesture meant to honor the dead tribute in your square becomes the quiet promise shared between thousands of people you will never meet. That part matters because a revolution needs a common language before it ever gets weapons. Now zoom in on Reaping Day, the most carefully stage-managed ritual the capital has. We're going to cover how that same ceremony can sour almost overnight. Imagine a year where whole districts simply stop dressing up. No bright dresses, no fresh haircuts, just work clothes and coal dust. Or the crowd that refuses to clap for the honor of being chosen. Total silence instead of forced cheers. Is that illegal? Maybe. Is it obvious on camera? Absolutely. Songs are even trickier. The capital encouraged heritage music around the square because it softened the horror of the lottery. But what happens when those old melodies quietly get new lyrics? A lullaby about sending your child to serve becomes a coded indictment of snow. Kids still sing. Elders still sway. The words, though, are knives. And this is where we talk about hijacking festivals and workplace rights. You don't invent new meetings. You hide messages in the ones the peacekeepers already expect. A harvest feast in 11? Perfect cover for planning a coordinated slowdown in the orchards. A so-called productivity games day in a factory in 8. That's when every machine conveniently breaks at once. Even the ritual of rotating shifts in the mines can become an underground courier system, passing information from tunnel to tunnel under the capital's nose. Here's the pattern interrupt. For rebellion to grow, some traditions don't get reused. They get broken. Families who always lit candles for the fallen tributes might stop. Not because they care less, but because they refuse to keep honoring the games on the capital's schedule. A victor who used to visit the official memorial wall every year simply doesn't go. That absence hurts. It can feel like betraying the dead. And that emotional cost is real. You're not just defying snow, you're arguing with your grandparents' ghosts. Do you keep the rituals that kept you compliant, or abandon them and risk losing the last thread connecting you to the people the games already took? The paradox is brutal. The same customs that once made the games bearable become the backbone of the revolution, with one tiny shift in meaning: a salute, a song lyric, a missing candle. So the next question is, how does the capital respond when it finally realizes its own approved traditions are now carrying the spark? After the capital falls, which traditions survive? So what happens when the capital finally realizes its own approved traditions are carrying the spark? And then the capital falls, you tear down the arena, you topple Snow's mansion. But here's the real question. What do you do with the customs that taught entire generations how to live with the games in the first place? In those first years after the war, you can almost see the council table. Former rebels, ex-victors, district elders, all arguing over the same problem. Do you outlaw anything that smells of the games, or do you let each district decide what survives? At face value, a blanket ban sounds clean. No more reaping dresses, no more anthem, no more may the odds. But that part matters because those rituals aren't just capital propaganda, they're also how people remember their dead. This is where we talk about the traditions that probably stay but change their meaning. Mourning rites built around tribute names. Songs that once had to hide rebellion in metaphors, suddenly sung at full volume in public squares. A district that used to hold a Reaping Eve vigil might keep the candles but turn the night into a reading of every child the games ever took. The form is familiar. The promise is different. You're not praying for a victor anymore. You're promising never to let the games return. There is a lot to uncover here in the argument to preserve some of this. If you erase every games-related ritual, you risk erasing the injustice that fueled the rebellion. Memorial festivals can become annual lessons in why the capital system failed. Imagine District 12 building its victory tour route into a pilgrimage path, or District 11 turning harvest celebrations into days of labor strikes remembrance. The relationship between memory and power flips. The same practices that once normalized horror now guard against it. But other customs, they almost have to die. Child practice deaths, where kids used to fall dramatically in the square to prove they wouldn't cry if reaped, suddenly look horrific without a peacekeeper watching. Career training oaths, swearing to bring honor to your district through killing, become indefensible in a world trying to teach that children aren't weapons. Reaping pageants, complete with parades and makeup, are the first to go. Because why would any new government stage the aesthetic of a lottery that no longer exists? Workplace initiations that used to mirror the games, first shift tests in the mines, factory contests where someone always got hurt, also come under fire. The reason is simple. When you're rebuilding, you cannot keep pretending preventable deaths are tradition. Even if some foreman insists we've always done it this way, the new law quietly replies, not anymore. Once the immediate trauma fades, younger kids will only know the games as stories. So why wouldn't someone stage a mock arena at a school play? Why wouldn't a teenager romanticize the rebellion era or cosplay a famous victor without feeling the weight behind it? That's where nostalgia becomes a threat, because it can turn atrocity into aesthetic. So we're going to cover one last problem before we leave Panem's future. If you had to write the new cultural rules, where would you draw the line between necessary memory and quiet re-traumatization? When does a song, a salute, or a festival stop being a warning and start becoming an invitation? Katniss, Peter, and the question of telling the story. So when we talk about drawing that line, you can't stay abstract for long, because there's a much harder question sitting in Victor's village, in one burned-out district on a hill. If anyone has to decide what gets remembered and what quietly dies out, it's Katniss. At face value, you'd think she'd just torch anything that smells like the games. This is someone who can't stand ceremony even before the arena. She hates the capital's pageantry, she resents being dressed up as a promise of hope, and by the time she has children, even her own victor status is something she hides rather than displays. So what happens when District 12 wants to turn Reaping Day into a never-again festival with speeches and wreaths and maybe a symbolic drawing of names? You can almost see Katniss shutting it down on instinct. No raffles, no stages, no children standing in rows, ever again. But here's the real question. Does erasing every ritual actually make her children safer, or just more vulnerable to the next person who knows how to weaponize spectacle? This is where we talk about Peter. His whole relationship to memory is different. He paints the dead. He bakes bread that tastes like specific days. He's the one who, even through hijacking and propaganda, keeps trying to control the story before the story controls him. He knows exactly how the Capitol twisted narratives into chains, because he spent 2 games and a victory tour being edited into a romantic subplot and a rebel symbol on command. So in rebuilt District 12, you can imagine a compromise emerging almost accidentally. No more parades, no more staged training games for children that echo the arena. Anything that looks like glorification, costumes, mock weapons, Capitol-style betting gets quietly banned at the community level, long before any national law steps in. That part matters because it shows you a district trying to detox itself without losing its memory. Instead, they lean into quiet customs, a day where people leave bread or coal or primroses at the fence line, a shared meal in the square where the only rule is that everyone eats. Maybe an evening where Peter tells stories of the tributes as people, while Katniss sits in the back, fletching arrows pretending not to listen, but correcting details when he gets Rue's song slightly wrong. And then there's the hanging tree. The Capitol once treated it as dangerous. The rebels turned it into an anthem. In peacetime, what is it? A lullaby? A warning? Do Katniss and Peter forbid their kids to sing it? Or do they explain every line until it's too heavy to ever be fun? There is a lot to uncover here, because even a song can slide from protest to performance if you don't keep checking the reason it exists. Now zoom out. Their choices are just one district's trauma response. What happens when District 2 wants honor guards and marble walls of names, while District 4 stages boat processions for fallen tributes, and someone in the new government says, "Is this remembrance or recruitment?" How do you write policy for grief that doesn't all look the same? If even Katniss, the girl who burned the games down, and Peter, the boy who lives by telling the truth about them, can't find an easy answer, what does that say about how deep the Capitol's cultural engineering really went? And if the people who broke the system can't fully escape its rituals, what happens when the next generation starts inventing their own? The darkest tradition of all. Teaching children it's normal. And that's where we hit the really uncomfortable part. Because when the next generation starts inventing their own rituals, you realize something terrifying. They're not starting from zero. They're remixing scripts the Capitol already wrote. Think about all the moments we've walked through. The family tesserae debates at the kitchen table, where parents quietly decide which child's odds can safely go up. The career blood oaths, kids in the training center swearing to die for each other so they'll be better at killing strangers. The mine initiations where your first day means being shoved toward the most dangerous shaft just to prove you can take it. Tribute shrines built from scrap metal, coal dust, or leftover grain. Black market oaths whispered over illegal bread or morphling. At face value, these look separate. Different districts, different customs. But here's the real question. What's the shared lesson underneath all of them? It's that horror is routine. That the games, the labor, the deaths are not emergencies, they're schedules. You grow up learning that every year some children go to the arena. Every week, someone doesn't come back from the factory. Every month, there's a whipping you're expected to watch. There is a lot to uncover here, but the core is simple. The Capitol's favorite tradition isn't a song, or a festival, or even the reaping itself. It's the idea that every generation owes bodies to keep the machine running. Snow doesn't have to say that out loud. He lets each district say it in its own accent. District 1 wraps it in glamour and career promise. District 12 buries it under coal dust and tesserae math. District 4 might tie it to the sea. District 11 to the fields. This is where we talk about personalization as control. By allowing district-specific customs, the capital turns one imperial policy, state-mandated child sacrifice, and expendable labor, into our way, our culture, our responsibility. That part matters because it blurs the relationship between victim and participant. When your reaping day has home-baked bread, special dresses, and a traditional song, where does the capital end and your community begin? When a mine boss turns lethal productivity quotas into a rite of passage, is he resisting the capital or copying it on a smaller scale? And even resistance gets caught. District 11's silent salute, Rue's song, the black market oaths to hide runaways or share extra food. These are powerful, but they're still built on the same ritual logic. Mark the body, mark the day, make an offering. You're pushing against the system using the emotional tools the system trained you to use. Pattern interrupt for a second. What if we've been asking the wrong question the whole time? Instead of ranking which tradition is darkest, maybe the real question is, what traditions would a free Panem have to invent to teach children that their lives are not payment owed to anyone? What does a reapingless spring look like? What replaces the first shift in the mines? And when you take away the shrines to the dead tributes, what do you build in that empty space? That's where we're going next. From dark rites to new rituals, imagining a healthier Panem. So if you strip out the reaping, the victory tour, the work games, what's left to mark the year in a district calendar? Do you just live in that empty space forever, or do you dare to fill it with something new? This is where we talk about replacement rituals, not a softer version of the old cruelty, but a different promise entirely. Because here's the real question. If the capital used traditions to teach you that your body belonged to them, what kind of traditions could teach the exact opposite? Start with the loudest wound, reaping day. In a free Panem, you could still gather in the square on that date, but for a reaping remembrance day. No glass bowls, no names. Instead, every district reads the list of their dead in the order they were taken, not the order they won favor with the capital. Families bring one object per tribute, a coal chip, a bread crust, a scrap of fabric, and build a temporary monument that is taken down at sunset, so grief is honored but not frozen into worship of the games. Then, weeks later, you hold a liberation festival on what used to be the victory tour season. At face value, it's just food and music. But that part matters because the arena used to be the only national event. Now the shared story is survival, not slaughter. You'd have community feasts where former victors and workers tell stories of how they kept people alive during shortages, or how the black market fed a block when the capital cut rations. The cameras, if they show up, are there to listen, not to script. Work doesn't get to be a punishment ceremony anymore. Either, imagine first day rites in the mines or factories, where older workers line up the new teams, and instead of hazing them, they hand over protective gear, a helmet passed down 3 generations, gloves that saved someone's fingers. The speech isn't "prove you're tough," it's you come home. And at the end of the year, instead of quotas posted in red, you throw a "we made it" night if the district hits an accident-free record. That's your productivity, bodies intact. Coming of age can finally step out of the arena's shadow. Picture a 16-year-old in District 3 building a small game console that runs a cooperative puzzle, instead of a battle royale, or a District 17 hosting a replanting day, where every person they've invited plants one sapling and carves their name into a shared board. We're going to cover how the relationship between skill and status changes when the skill isn't killing, but you can already see it. Pride without blood. Even the soundtrack of Panem can be reclaimed. The capital never understood why certain melodies spread, only that they did, which means you can keep the tunes and change the words. Old marching songs become lullabies about outlasting winter. Work chants turn into protest anthems that remember strikes instead of shipments. Recipes do the same work. The fancy capital version of a stew that once stretched a week's worth of roots. You bring it back to its district origin, tell the real story of the grandmother who invented it so 10 people could eat from one pot. There is a lot to uncover here about how food quietly held communities together when everything else was rationed. And this is where I want to pull you in. If you were standing in that empty town square, no reaping stage, no peacekeepers, what would you build instead? What holiday would you create to heal what the games broke? Drop your imagined traditions for a healthier Panem below, because the next part of this story is how those new rituals could actually protect the districts from ever sliding back into the capital's shadow. Your turn in the square. What would you keep and bury? So, let's actually do that. You're standing in that silent square in your head. No stage, no bowls of names. The games are over. Here's the real question. Which tradition that we've talked about would you fight to keep buried under the rubble? And which one, if any, would you dare to dig up and reshape into something healing? Think about the worst one first. Was it the district festivals where children practiced dying on command so they'd perform well if reaped? The family rituals where everyone quietly decided which child was the most expendable before reaping day, or those workplace games in the mines and factories that killed more people than the arena ever did, but got passed off as toughening you up for real labor? Name it in the comments, give it a district, give it a name, and tell us the reason it disturbed you more than anything the capital put on a screen. That part matters because once you name the horror, you can decide how Panem remembers it, or refuses to. Now flip it. If you had to salvage one tradition and reforge it, what would you choose? Maybe you take those illegal tribute shrines, all candles and contraband photos, and turn them into a yearly day of public mourning where every district reads the names of the dead, and the capital isn't allowed to cut the feed. Or you rewrite those punishment ceremonies into truth-telling circles where peacekeepers would have lost their power the second they raised the whip. Here's where we're going to cover your creativity. Design a new holiday for one district. Pick a number. District 4, 7, 11, 12, whatever feels right. What's the ritual? What's the food? What's the song? Is it a harvest feast where no one is allowed to mention the games? Or a last reaping festival where they burn the old slips of paper every year as a promise that no child's name will ever be drawn again? Or take one of the darkest rituals and rewrite it into something that actually heals? Maybe those body-marking practices that once branded families of cowardly non-volunteers become tattoos of survival and solidarity. Maybe the secret oaths from black market meetings turn into open vows of mutual aid between districts instead of whispered fear. And if you're more musically cursed than gifted, try this. Invent a coded song that could have slipped past capital censors. At face value, it's about coal or grain or fishing nets. Underneath, it's a map or a warning or a prayer. Drop a verse, a chorus, even just one line you think a peacekeeper would miss, but a rebel would understand. This is where we talk about the line between remembering and glorifying. Do you think reenactments of the games for education could ever be ethical, or do they always risk turning into spectacle again? Are tribute shrines a necessary wound, or do they keep Panem trapped in the capital's story about what a victor even is? Use the comments to debate that relationship respectfully. If someone wants a yearly mock reaping to teach history, and you think that crosses a line, explain why. If you believe some rituals must stay dead, say which ones and where you'd draw that boundary. Because our whole thing on this channel is exactly this. We pull apart the tiny details of Panem, the songs, the squares, the supposedly harmless traditions, and then rebuild them into full lived-in worlds. There is a lot to uncover here, and your versions of these rituals help us see why the capital's cultural engineering worked and how it could be undone. And if this deep dive into the capital's control over district culture and the false promise of hope through spectacle is your kind of thing, you might want to stick around. We're heading into other corners of the Hunger Games universe next. Places where the games never officially happen, but the rules feel eerily familiar. Bonus thought experiment, the darkest what-if tradition. So let's end with a thought experiment. Imagine you're not in the arena. You're in a classroom. Once a year, across Panem, the capital sponsors a mandatory games day in schools. At face value, it's an educational civics unit. Students learn about the history of the games, the glory of the victors, the sacrifice that keeps the peace. But here's the real question. What happens when you turn the arena into homework? This is where we talk about role play. On Games Day, half the class is assigned to be tributes. The other half, junior game makers. Teachers hand out cardboard spears, paper mutts, little arena maps. The tributes have to navigate obstacles around the schoolyard while the game makers design traps with colored chalk and beanbags. It's safe. It's supervised. No one actually gets hurt. But the lesson is clear. You're rehearsing the rules of your own potential death. From the capital's perspective, there is a lot to uncover here. It solves a propaganda problem. Children ask why the games exist. Now the answer is a unit test. They worry if they'll be reaped. Now they've practiced what to do. The relationship between citizen and arena shifts from horror to familiarity. The games stop being an aberration and start being a subject, a tradition, a normal part of civic life. So how would the districts twist this? In a hardline place like District 2, Games Day becomes a scouting combine. Teachers quietly note which 11-year-old can throw, who keeps their head under pressure, who volunteers to be a tribute even in a simulation. Parents watch from the fence, calculating. The promise of becoming a victor starts earlier with extra training clubs after school. But in a place like District 12, very different story. Some teachers drag their feet, turning it into a joke. The tributes all refuse to fight and sit down together in the middle of the yard. The game makers draw obvious escape routes instead of traps. An older student accidentally introduces the idea of forming alliances, sharing food instead of hoarding it. On paper, they're following capital curriculum. In practice, they're teaching strategy and solidarity. That part matters because it shows how thin the line is between education and indoctrination. If your first memory of the games is a worksheet and a role play, do you ever get the clean shock of realizing how wrong it is? Or do you grow up accepting that every district child must be fluent in arena logic the way they're fluent in basic math? Here's the real question. Would snow risk this? On one hand, it's perfect control. On the other, you're training every kid in Panem to think tactically, to question rules, to coordinate under pressure. How long before Games Day becomes Rebel Day in some forgotten classroom? So I want to know what you think. Does this fit canon for you, a program that almost could have existed off page? Or is this the line even the capital wouldn't cross without destabilizing itself? Hold on to that question as we move on, because our next stop is another place where the games don't officially happen, but the logic of the arena still quietly runs the show. Recap: the capital's favorite traditions were never its own. That logic of the arena doesn't stay in the arena. It seeps into everything the districts do. So let's pull the threads together, because there is a lot to uncover here when you zoom out. We've walked through reaping rituals, mourning and tribute worship, workplace rites, and those black market festivals that pretend to be cheerful. At face value, they all look local, homegrown. But here's the real question. Why did the capital let these traditions survive when it crushed almost everything else? Start with the reaping. Officially, it's a neutral lottery. In practice, you get family tesserae debates at the kitchen table. Who takes extra entries so the others don't starve? Whose name becomes a mathematical death sentence? That part matters because the capital doesn't have to choose which child is expendable. The district does it for them, in the name of survival. The pageantry, the songs, the nervous jokes in the crowd, those rituals soften the edge just enough that the games keep running without open revolt. Then you have mourning and tribute worship. District 11's bread for Katniss is the purest example. A sacred food rite meant for their own dead, redirected to a living girl who honored Rue. On one level, it's resistance. On another, it's perfectly safe for the capital as long as it stays contained. A single loaf, a single train car, a single moment. Shrines, carved names, even little body marks for lost tributes, all vent grief downward instead of upward. You cry to the dirt, not to the capital. Workplace rites replay the same relationship in miniature. In District 2, blood oaths in the training halls turn kids into self-selected careers, binding them to each other and to the promise of becoming a victor. In the mines and factories, first shift initiation stunts copy the games' cruelty on a smaller scale. The message is simple. Every space is an arena, and if you endure, maybe you earn a tiny upgrade. Not freedom, just slightly less pain. And under all of that, you get the black markets and coded festivals. Underground songs that sound cheerful but aren't. Children's games where you practice dying on command. Food rituals that celebrate a good harvest while quietly tallying the dead. The capital hears noise and sees productivity. The districts hear the subtext. This is where we talk about double meanings. One face for peacekeepers, one face for the people who actually live there. Put it together and the thesis is pretty clear. The capital didn't need to invent every dark tradition. It just needed to allow, shape, and selectively tolerate the ones that kept people scared but functional. Snow's hope versus fear equation lives in these customs. Hope stays small, winning a tesserae argument, surviving initiation, maybe producing a victor, never big enough to threaten the system, until someone breaks the script. Katniss refusing to play along, Rue's song echoing across districts, that loaf of bread crossing district lines. Those are moments when old rituals flip. The same structures that kept people bowed also taught them to coordinate, to remember, to pass messages in plain sight. So as we head into the ending, hold two truths at once. These traditions are horrifying, but they're also where resilience hides, waiting for the right spark to turn habit into revolution. Closing the circle, from a kitchen table choice to a world rewritten. So we come back to that table. One dim kitchen, one worn ledger, one family in a district arguing not about dessert, but about whose name can afford to go into the reaping bowl one more time. At face value, that moment is simple math. Who's stronger? Who can work more shifts if they survive? Who already eats less? But here's the real question. Now that we've walked through Victor's village, black markets, shrines, and those underground songs, what are we actually looking at in that scene? We're not just seeing poverty. We're seeing culture under siege. The capital didn't have to be in that room. Its rules already were. Tesserae turned dinner into a yearly strategy meeting about acceptable sacrifice. The relationship between parent and child gets rewritten. You're not just raising kids, you're managing risk assets in the game's economy. That part matters because the capital understood repetition. Every reaping day, every tally mark, every whispered promise of "it probably won't be you." Small acts, done over and over, carve grooves in people's brains. Snow weaponizes that. The same way Victor's village sits on a hill so every child can see the mansion, but not touch it. Tesserae sits on the table so every sibling can see the cost of staying alive. But there is a lot to uncover here, because those same knights also held something the capital never fully controlled. Maybe the older brother quietly splits his bread so his sister doesn't have to sign for extra grain. Maybe a mother hums a banned mining song under her breath while she counts slips, or they pause to say the names of dead tributes the capital would rather reduce to highlight reels. Those aren't big gestures. They're tiny edits to the script. Over time, that's how meaning shifts. The same kitchen where you once argued over who was most expendable can become the place where you decide whose turn it is to run messages, or which peacekeeper can be bribed, or whether you'll risk listening to a forbidden broadcast. We're going to cover huge explosions and open rebellion, but this is where we talk about the slow work underneath, the way a tradition can quietly flip from obedience to resistance without changing its surface. So what about you, sitting in a world without tesserae, but with plenty of unwritten rules? Which holidays, school rituals, workplace games, or family expectations have you never really questioned? Who do they serve, and who always seems to pay the invisible cost? If a custom always asks the same people to sacrifice and the same people to feel safe, that's a reaping by another name. Because the story of Panem isn't only about flaming dresses and blown up arenas. It's about who sets the table, who gets a say, And when someone finally pushes the ledger away and says, "No more names," the capital feared that moment more than any arrow. And the real tension is this. Once a district learns it can rewrite one ritual, what stops it from rewriting all of them? Next in the series, capital parties, district pain, and if the districts are busy rewriting rituals at the bottom, what's happening at the top of the ladder, in the capital penthouses and party halls? Because here's the real question. While a district is arguing over who has to stand in the reaping square, what are the people placing bets on those children doing with their own traditions? The relationship between those two calendars, district pain and capital parties, isn't random, it's synchronized. At face value, capital culture looks frivolous. Rotating hair colors, themed parties, trend cycles that move faster than a hovercraft. But this is where we talk about how those fun traditions mirror and mock everything we just covered. Districts have morning shrines. The capital has victory brunches. Districts have illegal oaths never to volunteer. The capital has sponsor clubs that drink every time a cannon fires. In our next deep dive, we're going to cover those rituals on the other side of the screen. Why does every game season kick off with not just the opening ceremonies, but a whole wave of capital betting pools, costume balls, and watch parties that map perfectly onto the reaping, training, and bloodbath? Why does the capital need its own ritual calendar to feel normal about what it's watching? Think about sponsor rituals. In the districts, a family might pass around a hat of food coupons to decide who takes extra tesserae. In the capital, a sponsor circle passes around a crystal bowl to adopt a tribute and pledge gifts. Same structure, opposite stakes. That part matters because it shows how complicity can feel generous. You're helping a favorite kid, so you don't have to ask why the kid is dying on your television in the first place. We'll also dig into victory tour etiquette. Districts have those tense, half-forbidden memorial customs around dead tributes. The capital has rules about when you're allowed to move on to the next victor crush. Why is it considered tacky to keep wearing last year's victor's pin once the new games start? Why are there unspoken scripts for how close you can stand to a traumatized victor at a party photo op? And then there are the dark humor games. Capital citizens turning tribute fates into drinking games, prediction boards, or punishment dares at parties. If a tribute from your assigned district dies first, maybe you have to shave your eyebrows or wear District 12 coal dust makeup for a week. It's absurd. On purpose. Irony becomes a shield. There is a lot to uncover here about how the capital normalizes complicity, the same way districts normalize suffering. Two halves of one machine, both running on ritual. If you want to be there when that episode drops, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so the algorithm doesn't do a quarter quell twist on you and hide it. And tell me in the comments, which capital traditions do you most want unpacked? Sponsor clubs? Fashion mourning? Those creepy betting salons? Your questions are going to help decide what we put under the microscope next. Community shout out. Your best Panem headcanons. And speaking of what you want under the microscope, this is where we talk about you for a second. Because if you've been reading the comments on these Panem videos, you know the Victor's Village isn't the only place running on ritual. You've been quietly building whole districts down there. One of my favorite headcanons from a past video was someone imagining District 4 holding a false reaping on the beach every year, where kids practice walking to the stage and bowing, and the elders judge who can keep a straight face the longest. At face value, It's a party. Underneath, it's training children to survive the real thing without breaking. Another person pitched this brutal District 2 tradition. New peacekeeper recruits have to stand in the square on reaping day and not flinch when the names are pulled, because the capital doesn't cry. That part matters because it shows how you're thinking about the relationship between local culture and capital performance. You're not just asking what happens in the arena, you're asking why the district would rehearse its own oppression. Here's the real question. If Panem is this underexplained in canon, who fills in the gaps if not us? Collins gives you a few glimpses, like the harvest festival vibes around the reaping, or the way public whippings turn into yearly lessons. And then she pulls the camera away. There is a lot to uncover here, and your headcanons are already doing that work, so I want to make it easier to find and feature them. If you have a district tradition in your brain, reaping rituals, workplace games in the mines, secret food rites, anything, tag it clearly. Start your comment with "Hey dear canon" or "District tradition," and then go wild. That way, when we're planning future episodes or community posts, we can actually track these and pull them in. And if you see a headcanon you disagree with, treat the comments as an extension of the Victor's Village conversation, not the arena. Ask why someone's version of District 7 mourning tattoos or District 10 livestock oaths works for them. Offer your own version, build on it. Respectful disagreement is how collaborative world building happens. You're not fighting to win, you're trying to map a country the books only sketch. Remember, the capital's world building strategy was the opposite. They wanted one official story and no questions. Our relationship to Panem doesn't have to work that way. The vagueness around district culture is a feature, not a bug. It gives you room to imagine the underground festivals, the illegal volunteer traditions, the shrine rituals the cameras never showed. If you want more long-form, lore-heavy Hunger Games videos in your feed, those headcanons, those questions, and yes, the basic signals of support, sharing this, dropping your theories, are what tell the algorithm this series is worth keeping alive. And keep those ideas coming, because next we're going to cover some of the darkest reaping day rituals the capital not only tolerated, but quietly encouraged. Fade to black. One last question for the districts. So after all of that, after reaping day pageants and workplace punishments dressed up as tradition, here's the real question. If you were born in Panem, which district's rituals do you honestly think you'd go along with without ever questioning them? Would you be in a SEAM classroom in District 12, tracing names on a chalkboard the night before the reaping, turning terror into a yearly family ceremony? Would you be in a factory district, cheering on some brutal first shift initiation because everyone says it proves you're ready for real work? Or would you be in a place where children practice dying on command in the square, telling yourself it's just a game to get ready for the real games? It's easy from the outside to say you'd resist, that you'd see through the capital's pageantry, refuse to dress up grief as heritage, never treat a public whipping as a lesson your kids have to attend. But this is where we talk about how traditions actually work. You inherit them before you understand them. By the time you're old enough to ask why, the answer is usually just, because this is what our district does. And that part matters because Panem is exaggerated, but the mechanism is familiar. We all grow up with rituals we don't name as rituals. School assemblies around certain flags, holidays that gloss over who paid the real cost, office games that reward overwork and quietly punish the people who won't play. At face value, they're normal, harmless, background noise. There is a lot to uncover here when you start asking who benefits. That's the reason stories like The Hunger Games stick. They take things our world normalizes, exploitative labor, unequal grief, turning suffering into entertainment, and turn the volume up so high you can't pretend you don't hear it. You watch a district hold a festival where kids rehearse their own deaths, and suddenly you're thinking about what your culture rehearses into you year after year without calling it violence. So maybe the real relationship between us and Panem isn't that we'd all be rebels in the woods. Maybe most of us would be standing in that square, doing what our parents did, repeating words we never wrote, hoping the ceremony will spare the people we love. And that's uncomfortable. It should be, thank you for staying in this world long enough to sit with that discomfort, to care about which traditions the capital weaponized, which ones the districts created to survive, and which ones might quietly mirror things we still do. Picture the district square now, hours after the ceremony ends. The crowd is gone, the cameras are gone, banners still flutter on empty poles, chalk names smear and fade under the dust. The stage waits, silent, for whatever the next generation decides to perform on it. The games may be over, but the rituals aren't. So when it's your turn in your own square, what will you choose to write there?